James Forrestal stepped onto the black sand of Iwo Jima just as the flag went up on Mount Suribachi. The Secretary of the Navy had come to the island personally, an unusual thing for a civilian official, and when he saw the Marines plant the flag on the volcano's summit on the 5th day of the battle, he turned to General Holland Smith beside him and said, "The raising of that flag on Suribachi means there will be a Marine Corps for the next 500 years. He meant it as a compliment. Read it again. The Secretary of the Navy, standing on a beach where men were still dying, was thinking about institutional survival. Not the battle, not the strategic objective, not the 21 days of fighting still ahead and the 6,000 Americans who hadn't died yet. He was thinking about whether the Marine Corps would exist after the war. There is one more detail. Forrestal wanted the flag as a personal souvenir. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, the battalion commander whose men had raised it, refused. He felt the flag belonged to his Marines. Johnson then ordered a second larger flag to be sent up the mountain, which is the flag in the photograph that became the most reproduced image of the Second World War. The inter-service friction that shaped this entire battle ran all the way to the summit of Suribachi. Subscribe if you want history that follows the decision, not the mythology. Iwo Jima is one of the most documented battles in American history. The courage of the men who fought there is beyond argument. The decision to send them there is a different question entirely, and it's one that senior American commanders were asking out loud before the battle was over. The official case for taking Iwo Jima rested on two arguments. The first was the B-29 emergency landing thesis. The superfortress bombers flying from the Mariana Islands to Japan faced a 14-hour round trip with no friendly airfield between Tinian and the Japanese home islands. Damaged aircraft had nowhere to land. Iwo Jima, positioned roughly halfway along the route, would give crippled B-29s a place to set down rather than ditch in the ocean. The second was fighter escort. Japan-based air defenses were intercepting B-29s during daylight raids over the home islands. P-51 Mustang fighters based on Iwo Jima could fly escort for the bombers and reduce those losses. In October 44, when the Joint Chiefs ordered the invasion, both arguments reflected the genuine tactical reality. The 21st Bomber Command was running high-altitude daylight precision raids against Japanese industrial targets, exactly the kind of mission that required fighter cover. Early bomber raids from the Marianas had been battered by jet stream winds that scattered bomb loads and devoured fuel. An emergency strip midway to Tokyo looked like the most obvious military decision in the Pacific. By the time 3 Marine divisions hit the beach on February 19th, General LeMay had already begun rethinking the entire bombing strategy. On the night of March 9th and 10th, while Marines were still fighting and dying across the island, LeMay launched Operation Meeting House, the firebombing of Tokyo. Low-level, nighttime, incendiary, no formation, no fighter escort. More people died in that single raid than in either atomic bomb attack. The tactical justification for Iwo Jima's airfields evaporated in the same week the Marines were paying the highest price to secure them. On March 4th, while the battle was still ongoing, the first crippled B-29, named Dynamite, came in through Japanese artillery fire and touched down on the still unfinished runway. Marines swarmed the aircraft. For the men who'd been fighting for 2 weeks, it was the first tangible proof the airfields had a purpose. The emergency landing figures are disputed in their framing. The standard claim is that roughly 2,400 B-29s made emergency landings on Iwo Jima, saving approximately 25,000 crewmen. Historians examining the operational records have established that the figure counts every unscheduled landing as an emergency, including routine refueling stops and minor mechanical diversions that posed no life or death risk to the crew. The number of landings representing genuine save-or-ditch emergencies has never been precisely established. A subsequent Air Force study found the contribution of the 7th Fighter Command operating from Iwo Jima to be superfluous, in part because by the time the Mustangs were operational, LeMay's shift to nighttime incendiary raids had made escort missions largely irrelevant. Retired Chief of Naval Operations William Pratt wrote in Newsweek in April 1945, the battle not yet over, that Iwo Jima was useless to the Army as a staging base and useless to the Navy as a fleet base, and that one wonders if the same sort of airbase could not have been reached at lower cost. He was the former head of the United States Navy. The battle was not yet over. Historian Robert Burrell argues that inter-service rivalry was a primary driver behind the invasion decision, a factor that conventional accounts systematically underweight. This thesis is contested. Other historians, including Brian Hanley, argue that Burrell applies retrospective criticism unfairly and that the planners of October 1944 had genuine operational reasons to believe the island was necessary. That debate has not been settled. The Marine Corps existed to conduct amphibious assaults on heavily defended beaches. That was its doctrine, its funding justification, its reason for being. By late 1944, the most important amphibious campaigns in the Pacific were either complete or shifting to Army-led operations in the Philippines. If the war ended without a major Marine assault on a strategically vital objective, the case for maintaining the Corps as a separate service after the war would weaken considerably. The Army was already pushing for defense unification, a restructuring that would effectively absorb the Marine Corps into the Army. The Navy was fighting to preserve its own air arm against pressure from the newly forming Air Force. Every service was simultaneously fighting the war and fighting for its post-war existence. When he said Suribachi meant 500 years of Marine Corps, he was describing a calculation that had been running in Washington well before the first Marine hit the beach. 22 Marines and 5 Navy personnel, including 4 hospital corpsmen who bled alongside the infantry under identical conditions, received the Medal of Honor for actions on Iwo Jima. 27 total, the most awarded for a single battle in American history. The machinery that sent those men to earn those medals was also securing a legacy, even as the battle's actual contribution to the war's end had begun to evaporate. General Kuribayashi had stripped away the traditional Japanese tactic of the suicidal banzai charge. He knew open charges only gave the Marines easy targets. Instead, he ordered his garrison into 17 miles of tunnels and underground positions with explicit orders to stay hidden, fight from cover, and force the Americans to kill them one by one. Every yard of that island had been engineered to cost more than the attackers expected. 6,821 Americans were killed. Nearly 20,000 more were wounded. Nearly 1 in 4 Marines killed in all of World War II died on that 8-square-mile island, and 1 in 3 of the men who actually landed there became a casualty. The question is not whether they fought with extraordinary courage. The question is who decided to send them there, and whether the reasons given were the actual reasons. While 3 Marine divisions were fighting across 8 square miles of volcanic rock, MacArthur's forces were engaged in the largest land battle of the Pacific War. The Luzon campaign involved 200,000 American soldiers against 250,000 Japanese defenders across an island the size of Ohio. Official 6th Army records document 10,380 Americans killed and 36,550 wounded. The fighting ran from January through August 1945. The Philippines sat astride Japan's supply lines to the Dutch East Indies oil fields, the strategic resource that had driven Japan to war in the first place. The Navy's submarine campaign had already decimated Japanese merchant shipping by this point, severing much of the oil flow before MacArthur's ground forces even landed at Lingayen Gulf. Together, the submarine blockade and the loss of the Philippine choke point left the Japanese war machine running on reserves. Every week the campaign continued, Japan's ability to fuel its ships, aircraft, and remaining armor diminished. Filipino historians have called the Battle of Manila the Stalingrad of Asia. The casualty figures don't refute the comparison. Block-by-block urban combat through a major capital city, the historic center reduced to rubble, roughly 100,000 Filipino civilians killed, many of them massacred deliberately by retreating Japanese forces rather than caught in crossfire. The destruction of Manila ranks among the worst urban atrocities of the entire Second World War. It barely registers in American textbooks. The flag-raising photograph is on coffee mugs, memorial walls, and war bond posters. The photograph that best represents Luzon, if most Americans could identify one at all, is probably not something they've seen. The Marine Corps understood early that its survival depended on public perception of its combat record. The flag-raising image became the centerpiece of a war bond drive, a permanent memorial in Washington, and a cultural mythology that still shapes how Americans understand the Pacific War 8 decades later. MacArthur had his own mythology, but it was personal rather than institutional. Nobody built a monument to the Army itself the way the Marine Corps Memorial built a monument to the Corps, which raises the question of what the men who actually bled for that monument were told they were dying for. There is one argument for Iwo Jima that survives everything above it. The ferocity of Japanese resistance there demonstrated to American planners what an invasion of the home islands would cost, and may have contributed to the decision to use atomic bombs rather than pursue Operation Downfall. The casualty projections for Downfall ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American dead, with Japanese civilian losses potentially exceeding that. If Iwo Jima contributed to demonstrating that conventional invasion was unacceptably costly, its indirect contribution to ending the war matters. The counter-argument is that planners didn't need Iwo Jima to know this. Okinawa, which ran from April through June 1945 at a cost of over 12,000 American dead and nearly 37,000 wounded, was a more recent and direct demonstration. LeMay's firebombing campaign was already killing more people per raid than any ground battle. The strategic case for the atomic option was overwhelming before the last Marine left Iwo Jima. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone is buried in Arlington. He won the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal for holding his position through the night with 2 machine guns, then walked the weapons back into action himself when the ammunition ran out. He was offered a stateside assignment. He turned it down. On the first day at Iwo Jima, he destroyed a Japanese blockhouse, guided a tank through a minefield under direct fire, and was killed by a mortar shell shortly after. He was 28 years old. He left behind a wife of 7 months. Whatever the battle produced strategically, the machinery that sent him back into combat was making calculations he was never consulted about. The Marines who fought at Iwo Jima took a defensive system specifically engineered to be as lethal as possible. They took it anyway. The decision to send them there was shaped by strategic arguments that were weaker than advertised, by inter-service rivalry running all the way to the Joint Chiefs, and by a calculation about the Marine Corps' survival that Forrestal articulated clearly the moment he stepped onto the beach. The tragedy is not that planners were acting in bad faith in October 1944. The arguments made sense at the time. The tragedy is that institutional momentum prevented adjustment when the tactical picture changed, when LeMay switched to night incendiary raids and the entire rationale for those airfields quietly dissolved while 3 divisions of Marines were still fighting to secure them. America won the Pacific War. The Marine Corps secured its institutional future. 6,821 men paid for both outcomes. Only one of those was the stated objective. 2 positions worth arguing about. The battle was necessary. The planners had real intelligence gaps, the airfields saved real lives, and the casualties were the price of ending the war without an invasion. Or the battle was inevitable. Inter-service rivalry drove the decision, the justifications came after, and the men deserved a command structure making decisions on purely military grounds. Neither position fully closes the argument. Which one do you think the evidence supports? Drop your answer below. Subscribe if this changed how you see the Pacific War. Thanks for watching.